Good morning.
Good morning.
Ooh, I like that. Good morning. I really like that. Hi, I am Dr. Kellie Carter-Jackson. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Africana Studies. This is my second year at Hunter College, and I am not Hunter College, Wellesley College. I left Hunter College. I was in New York for 3 years. I taught there in the history department, and now I'm here at Wellesley College. It's still early in the morning, so I can get away with it. So today I'm really excited to talk to you. You should know that what I do is I'm a historian. So I teach a lot of the African American history courses. I teach a course on the history of slavery in film, or Understanding American Slavery Through Film. I teach a course from Munbet to Michelle Obama, Understanding Black Women's History. I teach a course from African American history from 1500 to the present. It's a really big course, really, really good. And I'm also teaching Introduction to the Black Experience, which normally is a pretty small class, and this year I've got like 50 students, which if you know anything about the size of Wellesley classes, 50 students is a lot of students to have in a class. But it also tells me that a lot of people are excited to know more about the Black experience and to know more about Black history. So I'm also an author. I've written a couple books. Reconsidering Roots came out last year, just in time for the 40th anniversary of Alex Haley's Roots. And then I have another book, my own single-authored book, coming out in February, For Some Freedom. Put it in your Amazon cart. It's going to be very fun. That comes out just in time for Black History Month in February of 2012. So what I want to talk to you about today is why Black history matters. Why Black history matters. And I'll tell you this because I'm on Twitter, not so much anymore, but I saw this tweet and I thought it was so profound. It says, white privilege is your history taught as a core class, and my history taught as an elective. A lot of times when, oh, sorry, you're standing right in front of the, you're okay. A lot of times when we talk about Black history, we treat it as an elective, right? It's something that, oh, if you've got space to fill, take a course in Africana Studies. Oh, and if you filled all your core requirements, then maybe take a course in Africana Studies. And that didn't sit very well with me because I feel like Black history is something that all of us need to know, that all of us need to understand how important Black history is. James Baldwin has this great quote where he says, if you don't know my name, you don't know your own. If you don't know my name, you don't know your own. And because my boyfriend is James Baldwin, I can say that quote is so profound, right? That if you really don't know James Baldwin, my goodness, like, how are you going to come to terms with understanding race relations in this country? So I also kind of wanted to walk you through what Chimamanda Adichie calls the danger of the single story. The danger of the single story. And this is the idea where Black history, I think, gets taught as an elective because we only think it's about a couple of people and that's it. We really only cover like 2 Black people per century. And I'm gonna give you an example of what I mean. I think when it comes to the 18th century, we only talk about 2 Black people, and that's Crispus Attucks, the first casualty of the American Revolution, and Phyllis Wheatley. Those are the 2 Black people that are gonna get discussed when you talk about all of the 18th century. When you get to the 19th century, it's Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. It's always 1 Black man and 1 Black woman. Like, that's it, that's it. You get to the 20th century, it's MLK, Martin Luther King, and Rosa Parks. Those are the only people that we talk about. You get to the 21st century, it's Obama, right? I feel like it's the 2 people that we talk about per century. So this was troubling to me, right? Because I didn't want my students to think that the only person who helped slaves get to freedom was Harriet Tubman, or the only person who fought for civil rights was Rosa Parks and MLK. These movements, this massive change that we see happen in history requires hundreds, if not thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of people to get change to be made and to get cultivated in this country. So I want to talk about why Black history matters. To me, Black history is not just about understanding what makes America great, right? And what makes America great more than the greatest. It's not just about what makes Americans angry, because I think that's also really pivotal to understand where Black rage and where Black pain comes from. It's also about what understanding is not just enraging, but grievous to us, right? And how we find ways to really explain grievances, pain, loss, brutality. It's also about what can be improved in society, right? How we remember things, how we forget things, how we memorialize things. All these are intensely, intensely political. So I'm going to talk to you today about some aspects of American history that I don't think get discussed a lot. I can't do it all in like, 40 minutes, 30 minutes. But I'm going to try to give you some highlights about American history that I think you might be unfamiliar with when you realize the impact that Black Americans have had on that moment. So for me, perspective is everything. Where you start a story matters, what you include, what you leave out, what you place at the center, what you place at the margins, right? All of that is where you end has tremendous impact. So when I start stories, when I teach my class, especially when I'm teaching a course like from 1500 to the present, we just don't start with like slavery and the slave trade and the kidnapping of Africans, because I really don't think that kidnapping is a great place to start African American history. I want to tell my students about African civilizations. What does Africa look like before Europeans even get there? What do their kingdoms look like? Who are their kings? Who are the rulers? What are their civilizations like? How sophisticated are they? So I want to give you some examples. When I start teaching, let's say, African American history from 1500 to the present, I start with kingdoms, not with kidnapping. And to me, that's really, really important. I don't want students to see the Black experience as nothing but oppression. That people were rulers, that they were leading, and that they were leading really sophisticated, complex, prosperous societies. So I start by talking about Mansa Musa, this guy right here. A lot of people don't know that Mansa Musa is probably one of the richest people to ever exist in the world. Matter of fact, Forbes magazine did like a history of all of the wealthiest people to ever exist in the world. And can you guess, out of like the top 10, where do you think Mansa Musa was ranked? Anybody want to guess? 5th, 10th, first. Who said first? Ding, 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 ding. First, they estimated his worth to be over $400 billion. $400 billion. This is a picture of when he takes his famous pilgrimage to Mecca. When he makes that pilgrimage, he gives away so much gold, because he's got this gold nugget in his hand, that he devalued the price of gold for the next 25 years. That's how much gold he gave away. It was like, you get a gold nugget, you get a gold nugget, you get a gold nugget, right? Like, that is what Mansa Musa is doing. But we don't know about Mansa Musa. We don't talk about Mansa Musa. And how would it change your perspective to know that the richest person that ever lived was not just Black, but African, right? Like, that's mind-blowing. But it doesn't get discussed. So in my class, when we fast forward and we get past kingdoms and kidnappings and we get to the New World and we get to the United States, I don't start with Thanksgiving, right? I don't start with pilgrims. I start with planters. And I start with the state or the colony of Virginia. And it's so important that we start with Virginia because everything happens in Virginia. And no shade to New Englanders, but they love to see themselves as like a city on a hill, right? We love to tell the story of the first Thanksgiving. We love to talk about fleeing for religious persecution. And that's not that that's not true, right? But that maybe that story should be more at the margins and less at the center of what's actually happening. Why is that so? Because when we think about Virginia, it is not a coincidence that the first 4 out of 5 presidents hail from Virginia, that they all own slaves, that Virginia is the birthplace of the American Revolution, that Virginia is the largest owning slave colony, that tobacco was known as green gold, right? Green gold. That's how everyone made their wealth and their money. And that this idea of the American Revolution being intertwined with the institution of slavery is so profound. I don't think we realized how much slavery fuels that revolution, fuels our own American identity. So to give you an example of this, I talk about the American Revolution and I talk about the fact that there was a huge battle over whether or not Black people were actually going to fight in the American Revolution. George Washington said, absolutely not. We will not arm Black people. We will not arm slaves. That will start a slave rebellion. We will not give them their freedom. Even though all of the founding fathers are talking about liberty and freedom, equality, and democracy. So a man by the name of Lord Dunmore says, well, we're trying to win war. So I will let black people fight for me. And if black people fight for me, I will give them their freedom, right? So black people are standing in the center like, well, whoever's gonna give us our freedom, that's an easy call. We're fighting for the loyalists. So tens of thousands of people flock to Lord Dunmar. It's called Lord Dunmar's Proclamation. It is, before the emancipation, the first and largest proclamation that frees the most number of black people prior to the Civil War. And George Washington says something pretty fascinating. He says, if that man Dunmore is not crushed before the spring, he wrote in December of 1775, he will become the most dangerous man in America. Success will depend on which side can arm the Negro faster. Success will depend on which side can arm the Negro faster. That's the line you just don't get when it comes to the American Revolution. We don't talk about the fact that black bodies were dependent upon the outcome of the war. A famous historian, Edwin Morgan, says, to a large degree, it may be said that Americans bought their independence with slave labor. They bought their independence from slave labor. From the wealth, from tobacco, from the black bodies that were used to fight in the American Revolution is how America gets its independence. Really, really telling. So moving on from the era of revolutions, we go from the American Revolution, we talk about the French Revolution. In my class, we talk about the Haitian Revolution. Why? Because the Haitian Revolution, unlike the American Revolution and unlike the French Revolution, is the first and really only revolution to not only establish itself as an independent nation in the Western Hemisphere, but to free its slaves in the process. A lot of these rulers, Toussaint Louverture, Henri Christophe, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Alexandre Petiton, right, they were all the founding fathers of this small, all-black nation. And they accomplished what people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson never would have thought possible, was to free all of their slaves in the process, to actually live up to their creed of liberty and equality and fraternity for all. It's interesting when I tell my students about the Haitian Revolution and I give them this long history, because the war was fought for a really, really long time. We're talking about like 13 years people are at war. And this small nation, Haiti, is smaller than the state of Vermont, more mountainous than the state of Vermont. But Haiti produced more sugar than Jamaica, Cuba, and Brazil combined, right? Haiti was a major player. And the fact that it's able to overthrow this French empire is massive. And the fact that they own their blackness. One of the major steps in getting their independence was to take this French flag, this red, white, and blue flag, and to rip out the white and to say, we will be a black nation. This is how you get the Haitian flag, right? From the French flag, sans white. In the Constitution, in the Haitian Constitution, it says, to be Haitian is to be black. If you are Haitian, you are black. Even if you're white, you're black, right? Like, that is the idea of what they are. They were very much tied their independence to blackness, and that's so important. So I also talk about the Louisiana Purchase, because a lot of times we talk about Thomas Jefferson being this great diplomat. He was the great, Secretary of State. He made this great deal, and he purchased all of this territory that doubled the size of the United States, all because he made a deal with Napoleon, right? He made this deal with Napoleon because Napoleon had lost to some slaves, right? Napoleon could not afford the Haitian Revolution, and this is why he sells this massive territory. But we mention the Haitian Revolution like it's a footnote, and not as it being responsible for the doubling of the United States. And not only the doubling of the United States, but what do you think happens after the Louisiana Purchase is acquired? Slavery expands westward, right? Slavery, all this new virgin territory, tobacco was out, cotton is in. Eli Whitney makes this cotton gin, and now we can take this thing to Alabama, we can take this thing to Louisiana, we can take this thing to Texas, we can take this show on the road. So in my class, I talk about forced migrations. The first forced migration is from Africans to the New World. The second forced migration is from slaves from the South to the Deep South. 1 out of 3 families are broken up on the auction block, sending slaves further south. I actually did my family genealogy and found out that my family was actually in Kentucky, and then both my great-great-great-grandparents were sold to the Deep South in Louisiana. And it totally made sense to me based on this new expanding territory, slaves from Kentucky to now slaves in Louisiana. So, when we talk about the abolitionists, this is really important because the abolitionists, that's my bread and butter, right? That's what I studied. Force and Freedom is all about black abolitionists. And I think that we've perpetuated this idea that the abolitionist was sort of like this white man's burden to free slaves, this morality impulse that comes from white people seeing the error of their ways. And that's not necessarily true, right? Black people are always pushing for their freedom, and they're always pushing their white allies to see the problem, not just of slavery, but the problem of racism as well. Black abolitionists are like, if you free us, but you don't deal with racism, it's not really freedom, right? That we have to deal with this issue. So I talk about people like William Still. We talk about Harriet Tubman all the time, and I love Harriet Tubman. This is no shade to Harriet Tubman. She is a fighter, right? She is great. She should be on the $20 bill. I support it. But she is not known as the father of the Underground Railroad. William Still is. William Still was responsible for bringing over 800 slaves to freedom, right? And not only did he help slaves get to freedom, but he did something really remarkable. I mean, like a historian's dream. He basically took out this book and said whenever he got a fugitive slave to come to his door, he would say, tell me your name. What plantation are you from? Where did you run away from? How did you get here? How did you escape? Who helped you? And he would write down this story, and you can actually read this. It's a giant book. It's about 800 pages of enslaved people talking about how they got to freedom, how they escaped. One time, he's sitting down with the man, and he says to him, where are you from? What's your name? What plantation are you from? And this man starts to tell him, and all of a sudden, he stops writing. He says, you're my brother, right? He realized he was speaking to his own brother. And then I started to cry, oh my God, so emotional. Till this day in Pennsylvania, the Still family has their family reunion every single year to commemorate this moment, to commemorate the reunification of families. Still was one of 18, he escaped as a child, and he never got to connect with all of his siblings again, and in this moment, he does. I also like showing this picture too because this is a caravan of slaves who are running away. This story also takes place in my book as well. When you buy it on Amazon, that's where you find it. In which 4 slaves, 2 men and 2 women, are running away. And when they get to the border, they're at the northern part of Maryland. Some men stop them and they say, hey, where are you going? What business are you doing? Whose carriage is that? And they threaten to basically find out who their master is and send them back to slavery. And if you notice, it's hard to see, but this woman has a pistol in one hand and a dirk knife, like a shank, in the other hand. And she says to this white man, shoot, shoot, shoot. Like, what, you gonna shoot me? You gonna shoot me? Like, I don't care, right? Because I'd rather die than go back to slavery. My life is not at risk. Your life is at risk, right? If you try to take me back to slavery, you're the one that's gonna die. And it's interesting because all the white men are like, you know what, we got other stuff to do. And they literally let them pass, and then they tell journalists oh, we tried to, stand them up, and we're outnumbered, and yeah, right, lies, all lies. Right? When I get to the Civil War, a lot of times we like to talk about Lincoln, and Lincoln is great. I love Lincoln as a president. But the lie or the myth that we perpetuate all the time is Lincoln freed the slaves, Lincoln freed the slaves, Lincoln freed the slaves. And the fact of the matter is the slaves freed themselves. The slaves freed themselves. Even before the war starts, when enslaved people start hearing about the rumors of war and the fact that South Carolina is going to succeed, they start running away in the droves. By the thousands, slaves are running away. By the time Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation basically says it frees all of the slaves in the states that are in rebellion, right? But he doesn't say, hey, we're gonna come and free you. He's like, just get to the north, right? Just get to Union lines. Like, slaves had to get out of Dodge themselves. And then, when the war doesn't look like it's going to be so successful, they do what George Washington needed to do in the American Revolution, right? They enlist black men to fight, to help them turn the tide of the war. 250,000 black soldiers fight in the Civil War and help to win their freedom. A lot of people love to tell me about the film Lincoln with Steven Spielberg, and it's all right. But what I don't like about the film is that the 13th Amendment was not as radical as people think it is. The 13th Amendment, to me, is the coroner's report, right? The 13th Amendment says time of death, 1865, because slavery was already dead on the ground. Even the states that weren't in rebellion, states like Maryland, states like Delaware, they had already freed their slaves. So the 13th Amendment becomes this formality of abolishing slavery. But then we can also talk about how that morphs, because the 13th Amendment is also the main sort of prelude to mass incarceration, and that one caveat within the amendment that says that slavery is illegal, except unless you commit a crime, then slavery is like totally fair game. So when we get to Fort Wagner, we see that black soldiers fought. I like to tell this story a lot because one of the first black men to ever win the Medal of Honor is in Fort Wagner, and he's climbing up this hill, and he takes 4 bullets to the thigh, 4 bullets, picks up the flag, says, "Come on, boys, let's keep fighting, come on, boys," and they managed to never take Fort Wagner, but they fought valiantly. They fought valiantly. There's a movie about it named Glory. I don't know how many of you have seen Glory. It's also a great film that I also demolished in my Slavery in Film class. But it's a good film. It's a good film if you haven't seen it. So, moving forward, I'm going to get us to the 20th century. We get Plessy versus Ferguson. We get basically state-sanctioned segregation, right, in which we put forth this idea that everything is going to be separate but equal. It's going to be equal, knowing good and well that nothing put forth is equal. Even in this water fountain, like you can just, I mean, it's so clear, like these are not the same water fountains. The same water is coming out of them. That's the irony. But the idea that you would drink out of the same water fountain is not the same at all, and everyone knows it's a farce. One of the Supreme Court justices who gave the only dissent in Plessy versus Ferguson says the thin disguise of equal accommodations for passengers in railroad coaches will not mislead anyone nor atone for the wrong done this day, right? It takes almost over, actually, 50 years to make atonement for that. In 1954, Kenneth Clark gives his famous black doll test in which he basically says, listen, segregation is doing psychological harm to black children. Psychological harm to them. That they see themselves as inferior. And actually, it may seem a little bit morbid, but I have this picture up in my house, and I love this picture because it's so powerful, and because it talks about like the power, the role that racism plays on your psyche. And if you look at this picture, the black boy is looking at the black doll. He's looking at the black doll and pointing to the white doll. So when they ask them, which is the smart doll? He points to the white doll. Which is the good doll? He points to the white doll. Which is the bad doll? He points to the black doll, right? Like, and this is a young child who is being conditioned to believe that black is bad, black is defunct, black can't be smart, but whiteness is good, whiteness is norm, whiteness is beauty, right? This study has been conducted in recent times with Anderson Cooper. Same outcome, which shows you that the law can change, but until hearts do, right, until minds do, these outcomes will still be the same. So when we also, in my class, talk about segregation, we don't just talk about it from a Southern perspective. And I think that's really key on sort of flipping the notion of what racism looks like. It's so easy to put racism in these simple, simplistic binaries of good and evil, of North and South. Like the South has got a monopoly on racism, and like the North is so great. But I show these because this is Little Rock, 1957, and we're like, yeah, figures the South, right? But when we think about Boston in 1976, I mean, this 1976, first of all, is like last week, well, in my historian mind. and we think about, this is about busing, right? This is about desegregating Boston schools. And most people don't know, this picture is called The Soiling of Old Glory. It won a Pulitzer Prize. And this is a black man, lawyer, educated from Yale. And actually, he's walking to work, and he gets caught up in the mob. It looks like he's about to get impaled by this thing. He actually doesn't. The man is just swinging the flag, but it looks like he's about to stab him with it. But as he continues walking, he does get roughed up, he gets beat up, he gets put in the hospital. And I show this to students because I think that we have to get outside of this idea that racism is rudeness, that racism is a Southern phenomenon, that racism is geographic, right? Because it is not. Racism knows no bounds. And this is a perfect example of this. And even thinking that racism is about prejudiceness, I would tell people all the time, racism is about 10% prejudice, 10%. 90% of racism is power. It's just power, the struggle to keep power, to maintain power, right, to control who goes where, who does what, who gets what. Racism is mostly about power. So, moving even more to the present, I like to talk about Shirley Chisholm. And I think it's so important because a lot of times, not so much about sleep, because students are great here, they're really informed, but then people will say things to me like, Hillary Clinton was the first woman ever to run for the presidency. No, she wasn't. No, she wasn't. Shirley Chisholm was the first woman ever to run for the presidency. Not only that, she was also the first black woman ever to sit in Congress. And I think it's important that when we talk about intersectionality and how we talk about the fact that, yes, you can be this weird creature where blackness and womanness reside in the same body, right? Like, you can be a black woman and have a different experience from a white woman, right? You can be a black woman and experience something different from a black man, right? Intersectionality is really, really important. So, again, no shade to Hillary Clinton, but in my class, we talk about Shirley Chisholm because Shirley Chisholm is the one that opens the door in ways that just don't get seen and discussed. Oftentimes, I tell my students this really good quote. It says, all the men are black, all the women are white. And this because a lot of times when we talk about race relations or when we talk about gender, the default is talking about white women. When we talk about race, the default is talking about black men. And black women get excluded from that. So I ask my students, hey, what year did women get the right to vote? What year, people? Yeah?
It depends on the state.
That's a really good, wow, that's nuanced. No one ever says that. Most people just say 1920, right? Like they'll give like the sort of standard 19th Amendment. But my follow-up question is, when did black women get the right to vote? When did black women get the right to vote? Not till 1965. Wow. If we're really talking about the Voting Rights Act, black women are still not allowed to vote. Certainly not in places like Alabama, right? Certainly not in places like Georgia. That's really important to talk about. That's what I mean by intersectionality. We have to talk about these things. So, finally, I'm wrapping up, but I want to talk about why Black history matters through mass incarceration. What a lot of people don't know is that in 1890, Black people are about 12% of the population, still are today, but in 1890 they're about 12% of the population, and they're about 25% of the present population. 25%. How do we account for something like that? In the state of Massachusetts, black people are less than 5%. It's actually about 4%. Black people make up 4% of the state of Massachusetts. And yet 26% of the prison population. 26%. And in some cases, depending upon the prison, those numbers are even larger, right? And I think this fills in sort of the myth that we think. That white people commit crimes, but black people are criminals. White people commit crimes, but black people are criminals. That myth is a powerful, powerful myth, right? That idea that, oh yeah, he stole something, he's a good kid, give him a second chance, right? But the idea is when a black person commits the exact same infraction, it's jail time, and it's an exorbitant amount of jail time. I put these two pictures up here because we're always talking about, oh my gosh, Black Lives Matter, look at them rioting, look at them going crazy. One side is Michigan State after it won its game, right? Won. I was like, my goodness, what happens if we lose, right? Like, oh my God. But this is Baltimore after an unarmed man was killed in police custody, right? Unarmed man, he gets arrested, he gets thrown in the back of a police truck, and then all of a sudden, he's dead. How does that happen? How do you die in transport, right? Two different reactions, but still, boys will be boys, right? White people commit crimes, but black people are criminals, right? Black people are criminals. That is what we deconstruct in my class. So as we go forward, sometimes people may ask, why should we talk about Black history? Why is there BET Stacey Dash? And I say, this is a really good question. This is a really good question because this comes up all the time, more than it actually should. But what we don't think about is the reverse. We don't think about, well, why is there white television, right? Why do you get things like, I don't know, Friends? In New York City, both places take place in New York City. And you have yet no Black people, like one, like that's it, in New York City? Really? That just boggles my mind. But you get all of these shows in which they're predominantly white cast, and yet we don't think about the fact that people of color are not there. People of color are not represented. So we get asked why we have Black TV, but no one asks why there's white TV, right? A lot of times we do this with wealth too. We talk about Black poverty, we talk about mass incarceration, we talk about, whatever it is, whatever we associate with like Blackness and deficiency, but we never talk about the corollary. We never talk about, how do white folks win? How do white folks not go to prison? How do white folks keep their homes? How do white folks have value in their homes, right? How do white folks get into college? We never talk about the corollary, and that's so important. We always talk about the disadvantages of racism. We never talk about the benefits and the advantages of racism. People are benefiting and profiting from this systemic system. So I want you to think about these quotes. James Baldwin I put up here. I think it's really important though to think about like the names that I mentioned, people like William Still that you may not have heard of, or Lord Dunbar, right? Knowing that history, knowing these contributions changes the way that you think about the world. It changes your perspective. It changes where you start a story. It changes where you end a story. It changes what you place at the center. It changes what you place on the margins, right? All of that changes. And Martin Luther King Jr. says something that I think is so important. He says, change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle. Continuous struggle. All historians will tell you, nothing is inevitable. Absolutely nothing is inevitable. The Civil War is not inevitable. The Voting Rights Act is not inevitable. The fact that the slaves would just get their freedom or their women would just vote is not inevitable. These things come from constant continuous struggle. That's the only way that you get change. And then finally, Faulkner, love him, he's another boyfriend. He says, the past is never dead. It's not even past. The past is never dead. It's not even past, right? That we can talk about 1890 and mass incarceration rates, and we can talk about 2018 and mass incarceration rates, and they are almost identical. Because the past is never dead, it's not even past. And mostly because change is not inevitable, it comes through continuous struggle. So if you want to see those mass incarceration numbers change, it's not just going to happen with the passing of time, I can assure you. It comes only with constant struggle and protest and reform. So I want you to think about this because I think this is a great way to sort of end. There's this great quote, it's by, what's his name? Edward, I'm forgetting his name. He's a historian, just know that. He says, beware the terrible simplifiers. Beware the terrible simplifiers. So when we look at someone like Madam C.J. Walker, right? Madam C.J. Walker, first Black woman millionaire. She has her own hair care products. She's a boss in her own right. She owns her own movie theater. She has her own line of hair care products. She is successful. But no one would say to her in 1915, look at Madam C.J. Walker. You can be just like Madam C.J. Walker. Because during Madam C.J. Walker's time, 2 Black people were lynched per week. 2 Black people were lynched per week. You can look at Oprah and you can say, you can be like Oprah. Oprah's the first Black woman billionaire. You can be just like her. But even in Oprah's time, 2 unarmed people are killed by the police per week. 2 unarmed people are killed by the police per week. This is what I mean by simplifiers, right? By pointing to exceptions and not talking about the rule, right? The rule says, you don't get to be these people, right? But we hold them up as this great simplification of what it is that you can be without giving the context. I think it's also important, this is the last quote, I promise you this last quote. I know I need to wrap up. I love Amy There. He has this great quote where he says, Life is not a spectacle. A screaming man is not a dancing bear. A screaming man is not a dancing bear. He says, when you see black pain, right, it is not a dancing bear. When you see people in the streets with these t-shirts, right, screaming out, crying out, we are not dancing bears, right? This is not for your entertainment. This is not for you to gawk at like a circus, right? That this is representative of the oppression, this is representative of the strife, this is representative of the struggle. This is Mike Brown's father the day he laid his son to rest after he was killed by the police. We don't talk about black grief. We're terrified of black rage, right? But if we don't discuss these things, we are bound to repeat them. So one of the reasons why I like teaching, love teaching at Wellesley is because I can challenge my students. I can challenge them to see history as a power struggle. I can challenge them to search out for voices that have been silenced. I can challenge them to see history has successes and that there's justice, but that justice is not inevitable. It comes through struggle. I tell my students, I want you to be student activists. That does not mean I want you to get arrested. I'm on record, I'm on camera, I want you to get arrested, right? But I want you to work for change. And when I say I want you to be student activists, a lot of times I'm just saying, I want you to act on what you know. I want this information that I give you to be applicable. James Baldwin says it best, and I'm just gonna go to this quote. He says, many of them indeed know better, but as you will discover, people find it very difficult to act on what they know, because to act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger, right? It's to be in danger. So you will find that maybe the greatest danger is not getting arrested, but maybe it's those hard confrontations at a Thanksgiving table, right? That get really toxic really fast, right? And become in some ways dangerous to at least your moral or mental being or health, right? That a lot of times acting on what you know will cost you something. I mean, I don't know if you've done this before, but I've had like a moral meltdown in Whole Foods. Like, fair trade bananas are $5.99, but Chiquita's 59 cents, right? Like, and I know that Chiquita Dole Del Monte own 95% of the banana market, right? And I don't want to give them my money because I know their practices. But knowing and acting on that costs you something. And maybe bananas is superficial, right? But like when we think about where we shop, where we buy, where we put our kids in school, what house we buy, who we befriend, who comes over, who doesn't, all those things are how we act on what we know or what we think we know. If I go back to this quote, what I love about Wellesley is it says, non minister sed minister, not to be ministered onto, but to minister. Not to be ministered onto, but to minister. And I feel like when I'm in my class, I'm doing the Lord's work, right? Like I'm raising up a group of empowered women leaders who will not just be ministered onto, but will leave this classroom, leave this world, and go and minister to others. And hopefully help others, empower others, and pay it forward. So that's all I have. My final question to you is, where do we go from here? I always get that. So what do I do from here? I don't know what to do. What do I do from here? And my answer is always like, well, I mean, I don't know what to tell you. That's up to you. Right? So we will end with that. Questions? Any questions?
What's the name of your book again?
And freedom. I'm like, let's just go back. Can I go all the way back? It's been too wild. It's Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence. And my other book is an edited collection. It should have just been quicker. I should have just went to the camera and scanned, but it's okay. It comes out next year. I have a lot of slides. There we go. Force and Freedom will be out next year. It's all about black abolitionists and violence and how this group of black abolitionists basically say, listen, slavery is not going to end through moral suasion. It's not going to end through nonviolence. It's It's only going to end in violence because slavery starts in violence, so it must end in violence. And they start to arm themselves, and they start to form like militia groups, and they start to rescue fugitive slaves and get them to Canada and get them out of Dodge, and they use it by doing force. And white abolitionists aren't always on board with this, but it's effective. It's effective. And so my argument is that in order to get freedom, you're going to have to force it. You're going to have to force it. Yeah, right here.
I know that the Asian American students got together and got an Asian American line. I'm just kind of curious, how long has Africana Studies been at Wellesley, or do you know? And
So, good question. I'm a result of that. So, like, students fought to have the job that I have right now. We've had an Africana Studies department or major for almost 40 years now, pretty proud of that. As a result of the 1960s and student uprisings where students of all colors were demanding for their own departments, right? Chicana departments or Black Studies departments, Native American Studies departments. And up until maybe a few years ago, we didn't have a Black historian in Africana Studies. Africana Studies is interdisciplinary. So we had like a political scientist, and we had someone in English, and we had someone in women's studies, but we didn't have a historian, and history is like the bedrock of Black studies. And so they had me. Why not? So I'm really happy to be here, but I have all of the students to thank, because had they not organized, they literally took their petition to the president and said, we want a Black historian. I shouldn't say a Black historian. Someone who studies history, they don't have to be Black, but we want someone who does Black history, and I'm a result of that. Right here.
For the courses that you have taught either here or otherwise, are the syllabi available online?
Yeah. So I always we have Sakai, which is like where I put all of my files. Most of them I made publicly viewable. So the syllabus you can always view, maybe not assignments and things like that. But if you send me an email, I'm just kelly.jackson@wellesley.edu, Kelly with an IE. If you ask me for any syllabus, I'm always willing to share. I'm always willing to share what I have.
We'll teach high school.
Yeah, and even to give reading lists, I send out reading lists all the time. And reading lists that will be age appropriate, because I taught at a high school once, and someone was like, well, I've got small kids. I want to talk to smaller kids about this. So I provided a reading list for like elementary school kids. Because my kids are young, and I want my kids to see themselves in the books that they read. So I have a list like that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions? Oh, right ahead.
For history students, what is your personal solution or advice to get sources that are unbiased, so you have a more like wholesome and reliable perspective of history?
That's really, really good. So a lot of the times, I have my students do primary sources, right? So reading like reading the actual secession documents from the Civil War is really important in understanding what Southerners felt and understood and claimed in that moment. But I feel like there's a lot of really good historians doing great work. So I try to give my other scholars in the field that are doing good work as much pub as I can. So I put their books on my syllabus. I use a lot of books that have won tons of awards, that have been vetted. I use real historians, right? So we're not gonna be like on blogspot.com, like looking up stuff. I'm not gonna do things on like InfoWars or anything like that. Everyone who is read in my class is a legit historian who's gone to grad school, who has their PhD. And I may not always agree with them, and that's okay. Like sometimes I assign books that I hate, but they're good for fodder, right? So it's not about finding necessarily things that you agree with, but assigning things that are provocative, because historians don't talk about necessarily like the facts, like what happened. We know the Civil War happened. We debate though causes, we debate consequences, we debate like things that may not be provable, but stuff that we might have evidence to substantiate, right? We talk about the absences within history too. So not everything that we talk about is gonna be provable, but everything that we talk about is gonna be debatable, and I like being able to debate. That's what historians do, is we debate history, tooth and nail. It's hardcore in this world. I saw another hand. Was it a man? Did you?
I'll just thank you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Right here?
This may be a little bit controversial, but I just thought I think what you're doing is very, very important.
Mm-hmm.
But wouldn't it be, in an ideal world, we're looking at American history.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't it be better to include everything into that American history, including the history of Black America, the history
Yes.
of the Native Americans?
Yes.
And be looking at it in a fair way?
Yes.
Because otherwise, I don't think you understand the whole America if you break
Yes.
it into these pieces.
That's a really good point. It's my only pushback to that is that it's hard. So when I was at Hunter College, I was in the history department, and I taught American history, the survey. So from 1877 to the present, and from the colonial period to the Civil War. And I do all of that. So I talk about the Native Americans. I talk about what happens before Europeans get to the United States. I talk about Asian Americans and their role, because it's also really important. I try to include everything as much as I possibly can. But in a course like that, you're just doing broad strokes, right? You're just sort of like, you can't dwell on it, you can't get very deep with it. Everything is just wide but shallow. So the reason why these departments are important is because the depth that you want, the nuance that you want, really only comes when you can take a whole course and say, this is indigenous history, right? This is Chicano history. This is African American history. This is Asian American history. And really go deep with it in ways that you just can't cover in a survey. So it's important to have those specializations, even with women's studies, right? Like, I talk about women and the role of women, but if you really want that depth, that extra layer, you need a specialized course that's gonna do that. And even more so, you need a specialized department that's gonna cater to all those needs. Because there's so much diversity within just, indigenous studies, indigenous peoples. Like, that's huge. Like, are we talking about in past? Are we talking about the present? Are we talking about economics? Are we talking about politics? Like, it's so big. That's why you need a diversity of departments. Over here, and then over here.
Was this a summary, this slide, of this presentation of your course from 1500 to present?
Yes. So I gave you rapid fire, rapid fire history. So something like George Washington and Lord Dunmore, like that's a whole lecture, not one slide or two slides, but it's a whole lecture. I have a whole lecture that I give just on planters versus pilgrims. A whole lecture. I have a whole lecture I give just on like sugar, just on like a couple weeks ago, I did a whole lecture just on music and the music of decolonization, and we talked about like people like Fela Kuti and Hime Sakala and Miriam Makeba and Bob Marley, and like these are songs and artists that we love, but what are they saying and what are they singing about? And so I try to take certain lectures and just go really deep with them, but most of the times I feel like I'm just having to give really broad history just because we don't have time. Like my introduction to the Black Experience course, we have to cover Africa, the United States, and the Caribbean in 12 weeks. Like, so it's like 4 weeks on Africa, 4 weeks on the United States, and 4 weeks on the Caribbean. There's just no way you're gonna cover, you can't even cover slavery, you know what I mean? Like, in a whole, like, 12 weeks. So, yes and no. I expand upon this, but depending upon the class, depends upon the depth that you get. Hand right here.
Following up on what he said, it's interesting because what you're saying, in a sense, argues against the value of survey courses. That we really should be looking at shorter periods, more discrete periods, so that we can better understand the complexities of it.
Yes, I shouldn't say this, but I hate doing surveys. And I hate it just because it's shallow, right? Like, but in some ways, I know that not everyone is going to major in Africana Studies, right? Not everyone is going to take my course. And if you do take Introduction to the Black Experience, this might be the only class in which you get like that broad sort of swath. So if I go so deep, it's not going to be useful for you because maybe you're just taking this class to fulfill a requirement. Maybe you're just taking this class because you're in STEM and you just want something different. So what I hope is that what my classes do are they become springboards to the seminars. They become springboards to the classes that instead of having 50 people like this, it's 15 people around the table talking about just Black women. Like, those are the classes that I love to teach. Last year, I taught a course just on slavery, enslaved women. Like, the whole course was just about slavery and women, and it was 10 students of all different backgrounds, which was so fascinating. I feel like teaching at Wellesley's like teaching at the UN, and it was so great. And we talked We cried. I'm not ashamed to say that. Like, we have emotional intelligence here at Wellesley, and I love that. It was great. But not everybody's going to be able to get to those deep courses, and I'm okay with giving what I need to meet people's needs for the space they're in.
Yeah, when I was here, I took the Jewish experience, which was from creation to modernism.
Oh my God! That's like, so you know what I'm up against. In the beginning and then today. Right? Like, how do you That's wild. Any other questions for here?
Oh, this is very good, and I learned a lot. And you mentioned a word I'm just hearing about now because I'm old, the intersectionality.
Oh, yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Yes,
And,
so intersectionality, founded or coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a law professor at UCLA. So basically, think of intersectionality as a Venn diagram. So you have a circle, and then another circle, and then like the third circle. You know, like, I wish I had chalk. But like, so intersectionality shows like, what are the intersections? So, I am black, that's one circle. I am a woman, that's another circle. I'm not, but let's just say I was queer, that's another circle, right? And in the middle of that is also my identity, a black queer woman, right? Like, or if I were disabled, a black disabled woman, right? Fill in whatever those blanks are. So a lot of times we only speak to people's singular identity of, this is what it means to be black, this is what it means to be black. But what blackness is for men is completely different from what blackness is for women. So Harriet Jacobs, she wrote Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. She has this great quote where she says, slavery is terrible for men, but it is far more terrible for women. And that is because men and women are doing the same labor in the field, but women's bodies are being used for their reproductive labor. That's something that a man can't experience. So talking about what are the intersections of blackness and womanness? What is the intersections between, you know, what it means to be black and to be queer at the same time? Or, you know, and talking about the women's rights, I mean, the biggest reason why intersectionality came up is because during the women's rights movement, white women were saying, we want to work, we want to go back to work, we want to get out of this house, we want to go back to work. And black women were like, hold up, we've been working all day, every day, and mostly for you, taking care of your children, right? Like, we want to be at home. We want to take care of our children. And so there was big pushback from what people call second wave feminism or white feminism that didn't include women of color, because they're like, you're all talking about going back to work, all we want to do is be able to stay at home. Or you're talking about equal pay, we get paid even less than you. So you make 80 cents to the dollar, we're making 60 cents to the dollar, sometimes 30 cents to the dollar, depending upon if you're black or brown. So those disparities don't always get talked about, which is why there's a lot of rage among like black and brown women who are like, you don't understand, if you're gonna talk about femininity, if you're gonna talk about women's rights, you have to include our experiences. You have to include our identity, right? So that's where intersectionality comes into play. So it's really, and intersectionality can apply to a lot of different things, but I think looking at it as a Venn diagram is a really good way of saying, like, here's how we address the collective, but also how do we address the individual? And that's really, really important. Any other questions? Okay, yeah.
So what's the name of your course? You said Introduction to the Black.
Yes, okay, so this semester I'm teaching Introduction to the Black Experience.
Okay.
And I'm also teaching Understanding American Slavery Through Film. So we do, we go from Birth of a Nation all the way to 12 Years a Slave. We watch every film. We talk about the historical context and what it's made. We do Glory. We just covered Roots. Sarah's like, oh God. She's in my class. We just covered Roots. Next week we're doing Glory. We've gone the way in the whole 9 yards. In the spring, I'm teaching From Mum Bet to Michelle Obama. Mum Bet was the first black woman to sue for her freedom in the state of Massachusetts and win her case, effectively setting the precedent that abolished slavery in the state of Massachusetts. So most people are like, who's Mum Bet? I know Michelle Obama. I like the alliteration. But we're probably going to start pre-Mum Bet. We're probably going to start with like Queen Nzinga in Angola, and then and her kingdom and how she ruled her kingdom, and then we'll talk about like maybe Queen Nanny in Jamaica, and then we'll get into like Black women in the United States. But we're gonna cover everything from sexual harassment, like Anita Hill. We cover Beyonce because why not? But we're gonna cover like we're Harriet Tubman. We're gonna read Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Harriet Jacobs. It's gonna be a great class. And then what's the last class I'm doing? Oh, the African American history from 1500 to the present. So it's 2 classes per semester.
Okay.
Anything else? I think we're just out of time.